Good morning. Good. You guys hear me? Nice. Cool. All right, so this is the payphone you've dialed has been disconnected, the state and revival of payphones in 2023. Okay, so let's cover what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about who we are, what's a payphone. There might be some of you no idea what a payphone is. Start talking about our interest in infrastructure and how that got to mapping and scanning payphones. And then we'll talk about the FilTel project, where we actually got a payphone back up and running. And then we'll cover FreakNet, how FilTel ties into FreakNet, and then our future plans going forward. So I'm Mike. I'm a software engineer. I do mostly front-end work. I've been going to Philly 2600 hacker meetups for a little bit over 10 years. I've been a free PBX and Asterisk user since 2012. So I've been playing around with VoIP phone stuff for a little over a decade, but haven't really done anything too interesting or complicated until some of the stuff we're going to cover. So I've also run networks of Philly starting in 2018. If any of you were at Whopper last year, I gave a talk on that. And that's really just, I'm going around kind of cataloging and looking at different network infrastructure in Philly. And then a couple years ago, I founded Dial-Up World, which is the lowest tech amateur hobbyist dial-up ISP. So anybody for free can connect to a number I have that goes to a modem bank that sits in my basement and get dial-up internet. So yeah, I do a lot of weird little phone stuff.
Hey, I'm Naveen. Got my bachelor's in computer engineering over at Penn. I've worked in the IT industry for a couple years and financial and educational areas. I started out collecting telephones in about 2015, 2016, hooked them all up to a little Panasonic PBX and really got a kick out of that. So had some fun with that, graduated to messing around with Asterisk a couple years later, really enjoyed doing custom things with that. Started exploring payphones as well around the same time, trying to map out all the payphones that I encountered. So that was something I really got into, and eventually I started inventorying that. We'll elaborate on that more later. A couple years back, started FreakNet, which is a hobbyist telephone network that we'll also cover later. And also became a developer or a contributor to the open source Asterisk project at the time. So I've been working a lot with that since. Continues to take up a lot of my time, but really enjoy working on that. And then for any fellow BBS sysops or users in here, I also started working on my own BBS package, LBBS. And then finally, this whole time I've also been an environmental activist. Really twofold. One, trying to use some of my skills and experience to help out people that might be in disadvantaged backgrounds. So people who might not have broadband access, or low income or nonprofits. And as well as that, trying to think about the environmental footprint of communications and computer technologies. So things like planned obsolescence are something that I think about a lot. So that's a theme that you'll see throughout the presentation today.
Okay, so we got to get some background. What is a payphone? So show of hands, who here has never used a payphone? Okay, either everybody has or nobody wants to talk about it, but that's okay. That's all right. Okay. So this is New York City sometime after 2000s, probably early 2000s. So when you needed to make a call and you weren't home, you didn't have a mobile phone, you would seek out a payphone. You'd seek out this big metal rectangle attached to the street or a side of a building in a city, walk up to it, put in money, punch numbers to call somebody up. So before cell phones, payphones were everywhere. I don't think I can overstate the ubiquity of payphones. You know, you walk down the street, there's one on the street, there's one in a laundromat or any business. They were everywhere. And now we hardly see them at all anymore. We almost kind of glaze over, like we don't even notice them if we walk by one. They're just not part of our lives anymore. So most people these days probably only see payphones in movies. There's actually two of these movies take place in Philadelphia. So if you know which two those are, come talk to me and win bragging rights for which the two are. But yeah, that's kind of our time capsule into people using payphones these days is through the media. And we have these plot points that you couldn't reach somebody because you can't get to a working payphone or something, and we don't even see that anymore today. It's just, it's all but disappeared. So there's a lot of different types of payphones. If you're of an older persuasion, you might recognize the one on the left, a 3-slot. There's single slots, so we have 2 different types. There's one with a coin slot on the left. That's a Western Electric model. Coin slot on the right, that's a GTE model. So when people think of payphones, they usually picture one of these. And just so people know, there were 3 slots with standard keypads, and there were these single slot styles with rotary dials. But this is mostly what you would see these days. If somebody says, oh yeah, 3-slot payphone, it's going to be the rotary single slot. It's going to have a dial. So I mentioned earlier networks of Philly. That's actually how Naveen and I met. So I was walking around Philly taking pictures of manholes, manhole covers, trying to figure out mappings for different types of infrastructure in the city, like what telephone lines go through this manhole, stuff like that. So Naveen reached out to me, and we were talking about central offices from like old phone company central offices, and we started talking about payphones. So we went and started walking around, and I would look and find some, catalog them, see if they were working, see if they had a phone number, and that's kind of how we got started in all this. So before we talk a little bit more specifically about payphones, I want to cover the local telephone infrastructure just a bit. So Bell of Pennsylvania started in 1879 in Philadelphia, and that was a direct branch of the whole big Bell system. Around the same time, I should say a little bit later, in 1900, Keystone Telephone started up. So Keystone Telephone, they mostly catered to businesses or business-to-business communications, whereas Bell was more, your residential stuff. So people calling people, not businesses calling businesses. Some businesses did have a Keystone line and a Bell line if they needed to talk to those 2 different groups. And Keystone's big bragging thing was that they had the fastest dialing because they only had 5-digit numbers. So yeah. Eventually, Bell ended up buying Keystone in the 1940s. And over time, Bell would just gobble up all of these more independent companies. So in 1984, Bell was gigantic, and the government basically broke them up, or broke Bell up into 7 operating companies. So the one around here became Bell Atlantic. So Bell Atlantic operated in the area and then eventually merged with 9X and moved their headquarters to New York City. But then in 2000, Bell Atlantic merged with GTE to create Verizon, which we still have today. So in 2012, Verizon said, we're done with payphones. They basically gave up everything with payphones. They sold most of their inventory to this company, PTS. So PTS gobbled up all these payphones, converted some of them, got rid of some of them, installed new ones in other places. But they're pretty much the payphone provider in Philly. Although Verizon is still around, obviously, as you know, and they're the incumbent telephone company today, so you can't really escape Verizon if you're in Philly.
Yeah, so as the incumbent telephone company, if you wanted to get a traditional landline, so plain old telephone service, or POTS, as it's commonly referred to, Verizon or maybe resellers who you would go to. And Verizon in this area has actually been doing some pretty interesting things, which some people like and some people don't like, which is their policy of only providing phone service over fiber now. So here we're not talking just about Fios digital voice, which is their voice over IP digital voice offering, but even for plain old telephone service. So actually the past couple months I've been experimenting with this a little bit, trying to see what the most authentic type of phone service I could get from Verizon was. And so essentially what you'll get is you'll get it over fiber because they won't do it over copper. And the interesting thing is that it'll actually be connected to a packet switch, I believe at 900 Arch Street downtown. The interesting thing is it's not just for that rate center or even all of Philadelphia. Digging into this a little bit, we found that there's actually people as far out as Coatesville, which is almost an hour northwest of here, that are homed off of that switch. So Verizon really seems to be concentrating a lot of their services, including POTS, just in downtown Philadelphia. So unfortunately not as interesting as some phone phreaks anymore, but nonetheless interesting in terms of what they've been doing. So yeah, so as I mentioned, for a couple years, I've been trying to map out all the payphones that I've encountered. So a while back, I just started doing that every time I encountered a payphone. I'd catalog what I saw, I'd take some pictures, note down the phone number and where it was, and then add it to a map such as this one. And over time, that continued to grow. And I promise I have not been to all of these locations personally. As it started growing, people would send me in contributions of payphones that they had encountered, and I would also add them to the map. So this is definitely not complete, obviously. We definitely don't know about all the payphones in the country, but it's a good indication that there are still a lot of payphones out there that people encountered. And as you might expect, they're clustered in certain areas, like the Bay Area, for example, continues to have a lot of payphones into the present day. New York City, despite the fake news a while back about payphones being removed from New York City, there's actually still a lot of payphones, but indoors, owned by PTS in New York City. And there's still some even in Philadelphia, actually. So what we see here is another payphone map, actually maintained by another fellow payphone enthusiast here in Philly. And so all the blue ones here are the working ones, and the red ones are disconnected or removed payphones. And as you can kind of see, most of the working phones that remain are in the downtown area. There used to be some in West Philadelphia that I use from time to time, but they've since been removed, unfortunately. But if you're in the downtown area, you still have a pretty good chance of encountering one. So actually, just to point out a few payphones that might be a little bit more noteworthy. So this picture in the upper left here, you might actually have walked by this many, many times without really thinking about it, but this is the ramp at 30th Street Station, going up to the regional rail part of 30th Street Station, if you've ever been on that ramp. So you're coming down this long hallway, and there's just all this empty space here. But if you look very carefully, you can actually see the imprint where there used to be payphones all down that ramp. And obviously, those have now been removed. But that used to be full of payphones there. In the upper right is the payphone that was the last payphone at 30th Street Station. Amtrak actually had it removed, ordered it removed last October. But until then, that was a payphone that was there and used very frequently by a lot of people, got a lot of users. This payphone is still with us here. It's the payphone just south of City Hall on Broad Street. So that's there if you ever walk by it. And then these phones are at Suburban Station. So these are actually a little bit interesting because it's one of the only places, I think, in the city of Philadelphia where you have two working payphones that are right next to each other. So sometimes that can be a little bit fun. And then finally, you've got the payphone at the 11th Street subway station, which is connected to Jefferson Station. And it's a little bit dirty, but still working. So yeah, so I started out by just mapping these phones and where they were, what their numbers were. But at some point, I asked a question that seems pretty natural, right? What happens if you call a payphone? And back in the day, if you called a payphone, it would just ring because these were traditional payphones that were owned by the phone company. So there's really two types of payphones. There's the older, more traditional, often called dumb payphone. And these are payphones that actually require a special line provided by the phone company, a coin line that provides collect and return voltage and other control signals needed for the phone to operate. And the phone itself isn't very sophisticated. It's still got all the components in there to handle coin stuff, but it doesn't have any processing to determine how much a call is going to cost or anything. That's all done by the central office. In contrast, what we have more frequently today is the what's called smart phones, or COCOTs, customer-owned coin-operated telephones. And these actually have a smart board in the phone itself that does all of the coin rating for how much a call is going to cost. It actually handles dialing of numbers and dials them out for you, so it can do routing of calls through least cost routing and things like that. So it's a completely different type of board that's in there, and you can put that on a regular phone line basically, and it will work just fine. So the interesting thing is that these have modems inside them that are used for remote management. So PTS and other payphone providers that have these phones all over the country in the field want to be able to determine what payphones are full and might need to be collected. They might need to send a tech out. If something's not working, then they might want to send a tech out to check on it and visit it. So they want to be able to do all this remotely, and because of that modem, they're able to do that. So if you call one of these payphones, assuming that it has the right type of board in it, instead of bringing the phone and allowing somebody that's there to answer, what you'll actually get is the onboard modem. So I called some payphones at one point and noticed that I was getting modems. So the next obvious thing from there was plug a modem into my computer and see what I got when I did that. And so it turns out that these phones actually have no security whatsoever. So if you dial a payphone, you end up getting a printout that looks something like this. So let's go through this here. So this is actually a real printout from a payphone at some point. And it's broken out into some cryptic-looking strings here. But over time, through getting a number of these, I was able to reverse engineer most of this, and through talking with other payphone collectors, pretty much figure out what all this meant. So the first part is the number of the phone itself in 10-digit format. And typically, this will just be the number that you've dialed. So you can confirm that it matches up with that. But occasionally, the number will be different, usually because of a number change or something like that. And then the next component is the relative amount that is currently in the coin box. And I say relative because the math here is a little bit intricate. So skipping ahead to that last point there. So whenever a tech comes and empties the coin box, it will reset a counter in the phone. But it's actually sort of relative to, I guess, sort of the beginning of time for the payphone itself. So if there were, in this case, $678.05 in the phone, relative to some amount, I guess relative to zero, but rolling over every $1,000 since the phone was installed. So it'll remember that that was sort of the relative offset. And then if you count up from there, you can just subtract that to get the amount that's currently in the phone. So if you do that, this phone had $49.60 in coins in the coin box when it was called to get this printout. The next part there is the firmware version for the actual board itself. So I mentioned that there are different boards in the phone, and so these actually have firmware that's on there that you can update. And so 8822 is the most common model. There's mostly 8000 series firmware deployed today that PTS has. There are some 7000 series I've encountered, but it's mostly that model. The next one I'm not actually 100% sure of. I thought it was some kind of checksum or something, but I think it's probably more likely to be a PIN. Basically the way this works is that whenever the phone is emptied, this number is only reset whenever the phone is empty, but not every single time that the phone is emptied. So that's a little bit interesting there. And then finally, the last part is just the timestamp and local time when the phone was dialed. Pretty straightforward. So I got a few of these printouts. I was really intrigued by them because nobody that I knew of was actually calling payphones and getting these printouts because, you know, who would, right? So I started dialing some payphones that I knew about in my local area, and, you know, I noticed that the printouts kept changing. I could see, oh, like, you know, this phone made $3 yesterday, and I thought that was really cool. But, you know, as I started adding payphones that I was tracking, so maybe I was dialing like 10 or 15 payphones and that was doable. It takes maybe a couple minutes per phone. And at this time, I was just manually in hyperterminal, in Windows, just putting the number in and dialing it, and then copying and pasting the printout that I got and saving it. But at some point, that got to be a little bit tedious, as you can imagine. So I did what all good IT people do. I automated it, or at least I tried to automate it. So my first attempt to try and automate this was using AutoHotkey, if anyone here has used that. Some of you might be laughing right now because this is perhaps not the most appropriate solution for this. But it did sort of work. So the way it worked is that I set up an AutoHotkey script that would actually open hyperterminal and put in the number that it was going to dial from a list of numbers that I had in a text file. It would enable logging into a file in hyperterminal because doing that automatically, I think, is a paid feature or something. But you can do it through the GUI, so I had the script do that. And then it would dial the number and save that. And then I'd come in later, and there'd be some text files for each of the numbers that I dial that I could post-process and clean up a little bit. There were a few problems with this. The first kind of major problem was that whenever this was going on, it would basically take over the entire computer. And it wasn't actually even my computer at the time. It was somebody else's computer that I was accessing remotely connected to a POTS line somewhere. So he couldn't do anything with his computer when this was going on. So tried to have it happen in the middle of the night, but there were other issues, like if somebody came in and even clicked a button on the computer, it'd throw the whole script off and everything would get messed up. So it was okay for a while, but I quickly realized that it was not going to scale. So I ended up doing a complete rewrite at some point using a solution called Kermit, if anyone here has used that. It's actually, I think it's no longer maintained, but it's a project by Columbia University where they have all these utilities for both Windows and Linux for interfacing with modems. And it much better lent itself to automation. So using Kermit 95, I developed a script that could dial a phone number just in the background. And then wrapping that up with a batch script, this could all happen without really interfering with anything else that was going on in the background. So that's the solution that I continue to use to this day. It's not perfect, but there's still some manual steps involved. But it has allowed me to scale this project up to a much bigger extent than it originally was able to. So for those curious, I actually went through and sort of looked at all the data I've accumulated the past few years and tried to summarize it here. So here you can see the average daily revenue of payphones. So this is just using a sample of 447 payphones throughout the United States that I happen to have in my list of payphones that I'm actually able to get printouts from, because not all of them I've been successful in being able to do that. So probably not much of a surprise. There's a good number of payphones. This leftmost bar here is actually just 1 cent. It's basically nothing. So basically a quarter of payphones really don't get used at all. And in fact, looking at some of my logs, you can see that months and months and months go by and they don't have any calls at all. And so you might think that's a little bit weird. The thing to keep in mind, though, is that the way that at least PTS charges for payphones these days is that I believe it's a little bit under $100 basically per month. But if the phone is not making enough money basically to support itself, then they will charge the person that requested the payphone to be there, so the business where the payphone is, or what have you, to actually maintain that. If they don't want to pay for that, then they'll just remove the payphone. Now, in the rare case that it's actually making more than that, PTS will still give you a commission on the phone. And this was much more common back in the day when payphones were just making so much money that it's kind of a given that you would be getting a commission if you had a payphone. But these days, that's typically not the case anymore, that you can expect that. But in some busy locations, it is still the case. So 25% of payphones basically make nothing. But that means the other 75% of payphones make something. And that's, I think, one of the key takeaways from this is that oftentimes people have the impression when they encounter payphones that nobody is using them, right? But actually, that's typically not the case. And in this case, I have a lot of hard data where I can actually see that a lot of people are using certain phones, and I can even go and see, which phones that might be. So it is still the case that most payphones on their own are not profitable. They're in the less than $1 to less than $1.50, $2-ish range, and you'd probably need to be in the $2-ish range to start to think about being profitable. But people are using payphones, and even in this range, it's still several calls a day. So it isn't nothing. People are using this infrastructure, and oftentimes people just don't think about it. So these are some handy numbers up here that you can call if you happen to encounter a payphone. So as I mentioned, I get a lot of contributions of payphones from around the country, people reporting where they might have encountered one. And I think the most important thing that people can do is get the number of the payphone, because obviously that allows you to call the payphone and later check out how it's doing. If you just have a picture or location, that's good because we can add it to the map. But having a number really helps in terms of furthering our insight into all this payphone usage. So the top number there is an automatic number announcement circuit. It basically tells you what number you're calling from. And it's toll-free, which means from a payphone, you don't have to pay anything to call it. So you can just call 800 and then just dial 4s, and it'll read back the number that you're calling from. So super easy to remember. So if you do happen to find a payphone in the wild, and you have a minute to spare, definitely check it out, see if it works. If you are able to get the number and report it to me, I'd definitely be very grateful, because this is how I've been able to get such a large sample set and continue to get insight into how these payphones are doing. There's also another number that another FreakNet member set up to sort of automatically determine if you're calling from a payphone or not. And it can do that because when you make a call on the public telephone network, there's some information attached about the type of line. So it can tell if you're calling from a payphone, which is oftentimes, well, not often, but sometimes we might get a recording saying your call can't be completed from a payphone if you call some business. Some businesses will do that. And the reason they do that is because back in the 2000s, when calling card services were really taking off, or probably I guess in the 90s even, but I think sometime in the late 90s or the early 2000s, payphone providers were complaining that people were using all these calling card services, and because of that, that was depriving them of coin revenue. And so what the FCC ended up doing was mandating a dial-around compensation fee, which basically stipulates that whenever somebody uses a payphone to call a toll-free number, the owner of the toll-free number that's called will have to pay the payphone provider a set fee. So I think it was initially set at 25 cents or somewhere around there, and I think it's 49.4 cents today. So every time you call a toll-free number, the payphone provider is actually still getting something in theory through that dial-around compensation. So, if you ever have to call customer service, feel free to do it at a payphone and help the payphone provider out. But that is one thing you can do. And yeah, if you want to email any payphone contributions you have, you can feel free to do it to that email address there as well.
Okay, so eventually Naveen and I had a conversation, and we're doing all this stuff regarding payphones or telephone infrastructure. What if we start our own phone company? Like, not obviously we wouldn't be like Verizon or anything, but can we get phones working and operating and put at least one phone somewhere in public and have people use it? That was the big goal. Can we install a phone somewhere and make it work? So we heard about this project probably even before we even met each other, called FreaKnet. So there was a software engineer out in Portland, Oregon, who noticed that his gardener kept asking to use his phone. And the gardener was having trouble keeping up with his cell phone bill. So he thought, let me just get a payphone and install it right at my front lawn. Like, he had it in his lawn up against the sidewalk, and he just installed it, didn't tell anybody, and saw who used it. And over time, people ended up using it. So he made it completely free to use. He ended up installing more. I think they might have a dozen of them, most in Portland, but they're slowly moving east. So they have some, I think even as far as Detroit. I think they have one set up there. But yeah, we wanted to do the same thing, make it free, do it on the East Coast, and use as much discarded hardware and off-the-shelf stuff as we can. Nothing proprietary. Try to make it as open as possible. So we started to think, who could really benefit from this? So obviously, we thought it was cool. If you haven't figured out by now that we really like payphones and this kind of thing, then yeah, we thought it was awesome. But who else would use it? So we thought about it from like an artistic perspective. It's kind of a cool art project. It's kind of cool and in like a preservation or museum perspective, like here's a working payphone anybody can use. They can interact with one if they've never seen it before. But also we looked at the demographics, and there are still a lot of people, especially in Philadelphia, that don't have a cell phone. So the oft quoted number is I think 97% of people in America have a cell phone. And if you just look at the census for Philadelphia, the numbers work out so there's at least 50,000 people in Philadelphia who don't have a cell phone. And that's just documented people in the census. That's not even considering homeless people or undocumented people. So there's still a huge amount of people who could actually benefit from payphones. And even Naveen himself does not have a mobile phone. Never had one. So he's talked numerous times about back in 30th Street Station, he would go there to use the payphone. There'd be a queue of people behind him trying to use the phone. So they still get used. So this is the first payphone I got. I got this when I was a teenager, and I had no idea what I was doing with it, so I put it in my parents' basement for 15 years and then resurrected it last year. But this is a COCOT. So as Naveen said, this is one of those smart boards that does all of the coin rates on the phone itself, not back at the central office. So as you can see, on the left-hand side, we have the actual board. So this is a ProTel board. There's 4 big smart board companies. There's ProTel, Alcatel, Earnest, and IntelliCall. And yeah, ProTels and Alcatels are your more common ones. But all the COCOTs have the same basic layout of the board on one side, coin acceptor, validator on the other side, and then a relay at the bottom that determines if the coin goes in the coin box or coin return. So it's pretty modular. You can really easily swap in and out components. If we look at a more traditional payphone, one that would actually use a coin line, you're going to see a lot of the same stuff. So coin acceptor, dumb board in this case, relay at the bottom. It's all pretty much the same. I always equate it to like working on a classic car where you know you're going to have the carburetor here and everything just kind of makes sense. It's not too complicated. Yeah, so I have this phone, but what am I going to do now? They have, as I said, the ProTel Smart Board. That requires Windows 9X or DOS. It's archaic software. You had to be licensed to use this software. Even if you get it running, people say, oh, you need to have bare metal for the serial port. You can't do it emulated. Other people said you need a proprietary modem. So that was too much for me to try to figure out I set myself a goal by the end of the year last year, let me get this phone going. I think this was August. I was thinking, okay, let me get this phone going. So I abandoned that whole smartboard idea, and I learned about this. So this is a 2110V coinless board. So you can still buy this today, payphone.com, great for your payphone parts. Yeah, so this is a dumb board in the fact that it's not a smart board, but it's also not like one of those standard older payphone boards. This just makes your phone act like a regular landline house phone. So these aren't actually made any longer, though they're still for sale. So this isn't going to be a permanent solution. I'll talk a little bit about that later. But this is a pretty good drop-in replacement for your payphone to get it just so you have your RJ11 modular jack, you plug it in, and it behaves like a phone. So here it is actually installed in the one payphone that we have up and running. And yeah, it just goes right onto the back of the keypad. And people always ask about the paper towel tube. And that's because with the board, the coin acceptor Basically, it doesn't fit, the housing doesn't go together with this board and the coin acceptor. So I took out the coin acceptor, but I still want coins to be able to come in and not like short out anything on the board. So paper towel tube was the easy fix, yeah. So for actually having this phone connect to something, we need to set up infrastructure. You can't really get POTS lines anymore. Sure, we could piggyback off of like Verizon or something, but wouldn't it be cool if we also tied into our own network so we had access to different services, other numbers, stuff like that? So we came up with this solution. If you were at Whopper last year, you might remember having a little box and a red rotary phone around. This is basically the same thing. So if I go in further here. So the main, I guess you could say workhorse or key part of getting this phone connected is the Grandstream ATA. So this is an analog telephone adapter, and the best way to think of it is like a converter box between your traditional phone line and IP. So it speaks SIP, which is sort of the de facto protocol for voice telephony over the web. And yeah, it basically acts as a client up to our SIP server, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But one of the great things about these boxes is that Naveen's actually registered as, I believe, a vendor with Grandstream.
Yeah, and actually anyone can also do that.
Yeah, so anybody can register as a vendor with Grandstream, and you have remote access to these. So you can push config to them immediately. You don't have to be on site. So it makes everything pretty easy, and they're fairly inexpensive. They're about 30 bucks used, maybe a little bit less. So we also have a GL iNet router. This actually acts as mostly like a wireless bridge and a VPN client back to our server. For some installations, we don't even need this because that Grandstream device supports OpenVPN. And if we're hardwired into like the local area network wherever we're installing this, we're good to go. But this lets us do pretty much any sort of configuration. So if we're using like an older ATA, let's say we have something, SIP hasn't changed much, so we have something ancient like from the early 2000s, this will do the VPN for us. If we don't have Ethernet, this will do the Wi-Fi for us. So it sits in between and makes things a little bit easier. If we wanted to do something where we don't have network access, we can use hotspots. So this is by far the cheapest and still most reliable hotspot I've found. So T-Mobile used to give these away completely for free when you got service. So they're all over eBay. And they work stock with T-Mobile or any carrier that piggybacks on T-Mobile, which is a lot of the pay-as-you-go providers. You can do a SIM unlock with just this simple one-line command. And then you can also route them fairly easily, and you can get into all of like these service and technician menus, and you can change all the frequencies and all sorts of complicated stuff that I haven't even really looked into, but very hackable piece of equipment, very cheap. Oops. So yeah, putting it all together here, starting at the bottom, we have our phone connected to the ATA, connected to the router. So that gives us our local VPN network. We're going over some sort of internet connection. We don't care, up to the internet and then back to our server. And we do that for the routing of calls. And then from our server, that's how we can go out to the PSTN and make actual real-world placeable or real-world routable calls and also have calls come into us.
Yeah, so we've been talking a little bit about this SIP server that we've been using. But let's dive a little bit more into that now. So what we're using for that actually is Asterisk, which I mentioned earlier and maybe some of you have heard of. But Asterisk is a really widely used open source PBX and more broadly communications platform. So a lot of enterprises use it for their business phone system, things like that. But it's a really flexible piece of software that's also really easy to hack around with, as I mentioned, from the developer perspective. So here you can see sort of some of the things that it does. So obviously our ATA will connect to Asterisk using SIP. So SIP is actually just for the control signaling, but the audio itself will go over RTP. But you can sort of think of them as coming together. And then Asterisk We'll also speak SIP with a VoIP provider that will actually provide for inbound and outbound calls from the public switch telephone network. So that means you can call the payphone from any other public phone, and you can also call any other phone in the US from the payphone, or whatever we have connected to it. So that's all completely pluggable. You can use whatever provider you want there. All you need is a SIP trunk setup, essentially. And then Asterisk itself also supports a lot of other protocols. The SIP is just one of them, but it supports other protocols. So EEX2 is another lesser used protocol these days, but still somewhat common for trunking between Asterisk systems themselves. So the original use case for this was large enterprises that might have PBXs, phone systems, throughout the country. It wouldn't really make sense to make calls between the systems over the public telephone network when you just have the internet. So EEX is a really nice protocol for trunking calls between Asterisk systems in an optimal way. So basically giving you free calling between all your branch offices. But today it's also used by a lot of hobbyists and telephone collectors who themselves have Asterisk systems at their house or for their own phones, trunking calls between each other. So there are different networks such as FreakNet, which I'll talk about in a bit, where hobbyist telephone collectors can actually call each other. And this is basically how it works using the EEX protocol. And then finally, we've also got the more traditional telephony protocol. So this is actually the DOTI channel driver, which is a little bit of a funny name, but that's the acronym there. And this is what you'd use for actually connecting physical telephony cards like to your telephony server in a PCI slot, either for direct phone jacks or for maybe a T1 interface that you can connect a channel bank or something like that to. So talking a little bit about FreakNet, which I've mentioned a couple times. So this is a hobbyist telephone network that I got going a couple years back. And the idea behind it was to basically try to recreate, emulate as much as possible the old telephone network as it worked and as it sounded, as it felt basically. Try to create sort of an immersive experience for users. So obviously the free calling between different FreakNet switches is certainly integral to how it all works, but in trying to make it a more encompassing thing. So a lot of this is stuff that was more common back in the day, I suppose. But for example, you can call 0 and get an operator, talk to directory assistants. But there's also things that might be a little bit more appealing to phone freaks, such as being able to blue box or red box like back in the day. So I'm not going to dive too much into that here, but blue boxing basically being if your call was going over a 2600 hertz controlled trunk, you could just reseize that trunk with 2600 and reroute your call. So this resulted in a lot of toll fraud back in the 60s and 70s. You don't see it on the public network anymore thanks to out-of-band signaling. But you can still blue box on FreakNet because we've got these 2600 hertz controlled trunks. Red boxing was for payphones specifically, so I'd be remiss not to mention that. So with the single slot payphones, the 3-slot payphones just had gongs in them. So there was never really any automation for that. But throughout the 70s, as automation came in, they actually had machines that would listen for the tones generated by payphones when you put money in them. And people figured out it was very easy to just recreate the tones and then fool the switch into thinking that you deposited money. So that's what a red box is for, fairly straightforward. And we've got coin trunks where people can hook up their payphones and also red box their phones if they want to. So interesting stuff like that. This is another component of the system. So we have a mock billing system, essentially, where for all the calls that are placed on the network, particularly long distance, they're all ticketed and stored in a system where at the end of every month, we actually issue a bill to all of our users, showing them exactly how much their calls would have cost back in, these are using 1977 rates. So thankfully, I don't have to pay that bill at the end of the month because this is all just for fun. But it does provide some interesting perspective into the way that communications have changed. And back then, certainly, you would have been thinking very consciously about making these calls if you were doing that. But this is just a nice, fun aspect to all of this.
Yeah, so as Naveen said, we had FreakNet, we have the Payphone. It's pretty trivial to connect it to the PSTN, so you can make calls out, you can take calls in. But we integrated FreakNet with FilTel, and when we installed our first phone on December 17th at Iffy Books, it's a great bookstore in Philadelphia, we had a party, essentially. A lot of hackers showed up, some old freakers showed up, Dan ordered pizza, it was a great time. But yeah, we had people, of course, calling yourself is novel, calling the payphone is novel, but then people really started to explore some of the FreakNet connectivity, and we had people there blue boxing the payphone. We had people red boxing the payphone, exploring all these numbers. So yeah, it was a great time. And then that day, I actually learned that Iffy Books was moving somewhere else in the building in like 2 weeks, so I had to redo the whole installation by myself 2 weeks later. But yeah, don't worry, it's fairly easy to reinstall a payphone. Yeah, so when we announced that we were doing this, we thought we would be pretty much the only people that cared. And somehow the news picked this up. There was some like small online Linux magazine that reached out to me to ask me a couple questions, and then word got out, I guess. So like CNN, Washington Post, The Inquirer, a bunch, NPR, like it's weird getting cold called by NPR. But yeah, just all of these different news outlets wanted to cover this phone, and it was wild. We didn't think anything like this would happen at all. But yeah, it seems like it really struck a chord with people, and it was cool. I know you're never supposed to read the comments on like news sites, but I peeked a little bit, and there were so many people who were like, wow, what a great idea. Like, you're making all this free for people to use, how fantastic. And then people started getting in contact with me saying, hey, I have this payphone I've been doing nothing with for 30 years. It's taking up space. I was waiting for the right person at the right time. Do you want it? And of course you say yes. Don't even ask for pictures. And people started sending me stuff. So really cool that there was just so much support. And I don't really even recall any naysayers. Nobody told me that this was stupid. So I guess I was doing something right. I don't know. But yeah, going more towards the future, we want to do more installations. So getting that first phone working was definitely a challenge. And then after doing so, there was tons of people who now say, we want a phone, but there's all this back-end legwork we sort of have to do. Can we make everything stable for more phones? We probably should have some sort of logging mechanism so we know if something breaks, stuff like that. So all of these blue dots are people who have said they want phones, and then the purple dots are places where somebody's told us, hey, this place could probably use a phone, but yeah, we haven't actually made that contact with them yet. So there is interest, and we hope to start sort of filling that out once we make sure all the new hardware we've got works and that we have enough logging and everything so that if something breaks, we know it breaks so we can go fix it. We also want to get a free COCOT programming line set up. So I had mentioned that ProTel board. We've been making strides to actually have real hardware to run the software. We've gotten other versions of software that some kind people have archived for us. And basically, we're trying every combination of things to get this software running either on real hardware, virtualized. Those proprietary modems I was talking about, I've got 2 of them. One of them works, but I tracked them down. I got 2 of them. We're going to make something work with this. We're going to have a free number, so any of those people out there with payphones in their garages with these old smart boards you can't really do anything with, we're going to try to get a free line so they can actually do something with them. But yeah, that also leads into the sort of archaeology and preservation aspect. It's cool to be able to go up to one of these phones and connect on something like FreakNet and do all sorts of these tricks you could do back in the 70s and 80s. But it's also cool to kind of be a repository for software that you can use to configure these phones. Or if somebody donates a board, we can take the EEPROMs off of them, get a copy of that so that in the future somebody wanders along. I have this old board. The ROM is bad. Oh, we have the ROM for you. So it transitions a bit into living museum as well as we get all of this stuff, and we can help other people who want to do the same thing or just want to get their phone in their garage working. And that's it.
Awesome. We have about 10 minutes for questions. Please use the microphone up front if you have any questions.
They're speechless. All right, cool. Yeah, we are upstairs in the chill room. We have a whole bunch of phones there if you haven't seen yet or heard yet. So yeah, if you have any questions that come up or you want to know any more about any of this, we are up there for the rest of the day, so find us.